This video isn't meant to be inflammatory. I'm well aware that the consensus on Brand New Day is pretty positive, and I don't mean to be contrarian. In fact, I really wish I can enjoy Brand New Day the same way other people do and be in on the fun. I really love Spider-Man and do wish that I had enjoyed the movie more. There's pretty much a constant stream of positive discourse flowing about it at the moment, and at times it almost feels like a prison of my own creation. But I can't really ignore how I feel about it, and I think expressing my opinion and thoughts on it will help me stop thinking about it so much, so here we are. The main thesis of this video revolves around a belief that I've developed while seeing the response to Brand New Day after watching the movie for myself. It's based around something called the Overton window, the concept of which has its origins in political discourse. It's the idea that over time, people and beliefs that were once seen as outliers, extremists, or abnormal can shift into being normal and populist discourse. I believe that there's an Overton window for media in general, but especially superheroes and Spider-Man, and I think it's shifted over the years. This window applies a lot to the current day, but it can go backwards in time too. I think a lot of things that audiences definitely wouldn't have tolerated, or things that would have been critiqued in the past, really get a pass nowadays. Especially when it comes from big franchises. Overstuffed plots, sequel baiting, bad CGI, lots of stuff that would get early 2000s, or really any pre-Iron Man superhero movies completely dogged on critically, has been given way more leeway in modern day superhero movies. But it does require certain context for it. There's definitely an argument in some cases that it's purely due to nostalgia, but I don't think it encapsulates the whole picture. While I would have no doubt in saying that part of it is due to the fact that media literacy has gone down over the years, and this isn't me being rude to modern audiences, there's been surveys and studies attesting to the fact where people themselves admit that they haven't been properly taught how to analyze media. I also think it has to do with the fact that the way we consume, critique, make and release movies has changed dramatically. To steal an example that my friend made when I was explaining this that pretty perfectly encapsulates my point is the Star Wars prequels. There was a full consensus that they were dog shit movies that have boring plots, horrible pacing, bad CGI, abrasive and even at times offensive characters, and critically got pretty shat on even if they did put up numbers at the box office. And then years later, there's been a full renaissance on the public opinions of these movies. The diatribe has faded and people opine about how the prequels really were the good old days. Why? Nostalgia definitely has something to do with it, but I think it's because the context surrounding those movies has grown exponentially. But there's been so much substantiating media that's focused around the prequel content that there's reason now to think highly of those movies. The Clone Wars show, Battlefront, Star Wars Fallen Order / Survivor, Andor, Rogue One, Tales of the Jedi, Star Wars Rebels, all of the context that takes place around the movie has shifted the view people have from the events, themes, settings, and stories that came from those movies. So while a lot of people do still recognize the bad parts, a lot more appreciation is spouted from those movies than ever before. I think that there's been a very similar effect with superhero movies, especially with Spider-Man, who by himself is in a tier of its own when it comes to cultural significance and presence. Things that would have been crucified in the far distant past of the 2000s really aren't as big of a deal to audiences anymore. This isn't to say that Spider-Man Brand New Day is as bad as any of the prequel movies or Rise of Skywalker, but I think that some of the rough around the edges aspects of the movie, in my personal opinion, are things that would have been criticized in a more apparent manner if the movie was released in a random year like, I don't know, 2007. It's a movie with an abundance of characters who all have to fight for screen time and focus, some of which don't feel necessary for the narrative, a variety of plot lines that often clash with one another, and Peter dealing with a transformation that makes his social life and superhero work more difficult that doesn't feel fleshed out enough. That sounds vaguely familiar.
See you, chump.
I wholeheartedly believe that if Spider-Man 3 came out today, it would have received immensely more praise compared to how it was when the movie came out. The context around superhero movies has just shifted in a way that fostered an easier environment for some movies to thrive in. Spider-Man movies will always print money, that part would never be in doubt, but the crammed in characters, chaotic plot delivery, looser handling of the lore from the comics that are all present in Spider-Man 3, is something that is found way more in superhero movies nowadays, and something that people are willing to be way more accepting of if given the right reason. The right reason being Spider-Man is a pretty high success rate generally, but there's other notable movies that didn't get so lucky when it comes to getting grace. Eternals is a notable example of a long-winded, messy plot with ugly visuals, boring character writing, and a movie that feels pulled straight from the 2000s and definitely not to its benefit. In terms of a movie that I think slots up as a better example compared to Brand New Day, however, I think there's an MCU movie that fits the bill. While watching Brand New Day, I didn't think it was the worst movie I've ever seen. It was technically very impressive at times, and there were scenes I greatly enjoyed. However, there are so many issues that build up in my mind that make the movie difficult to enjoy. When I was thinking about the movie afterwards, it reminded me a lot of another MCU flick that I really wasn't a fan of for a lot of the same reasons. Captain America: Brave New World is, in my opinion, one of the least enjoyable MCU movies I've watched, and personally was a breaking point in my enjoyment of most MCU products. Probably stems from the fact that I'm a pretty big Sam Wilson fan and I was personally pretty disappointed by the movie. I think it commits many of the same sins that Brand New Day does, but got less of a pass because the story is even more of a mess and it doesn't include the most popular superhero of all time. It takes the main character and basically puts them in a situation that's hardly unique to them, where you could realistically switch them out for another character and not much would change. It shoves in a lot of milquetoast MCU world building that feels like it was forced in by Grand Wizard Kevin Feige. It uses a lot of elements that originate from another character's lore and feel like they're meant to be in a completely different movie, especially the villain being from another canon entirely. They also both shove Hulk lore into the movie unnecessarily for some reason. I don't really enjoy the fact that both of the movies don't feel like they're real stories, as much as they feel like they're trying to set up plot lines that will probably come into play in the next movie. But it takes me out of the viewing experience too much. It's a disjointed compilation of exposition getting shoved down my throat when I'm just here to watch Sam or Peter in their worlds fighting their bad guys and being themselves. Instead, at times it feels as if I'm supposed to be on autopilot and clap when the fight scenes happen and point at the screen when the thing I recognize appears, even if it doesn't feel like it should be there. There's parts that feel accurate to the characters, where characters from their personal canon show up or plot lines that you recognize appear, but it doesn't feel like it's enough for the movie to be complete. Why is the leader the main antagonist instead of the Serpent Society and Sidewinder having a bigger role? By the way, getting Giancarlo Esposito in the movie for like 20 minutes of screen time is crazy. Why Jean Grey instead of Mr. Negative, who could have served a similar role and purpose as Jean Grey, while also being an actual Spider-Man villain and also having a more personal connection to Peter? Hulk being in the movie basically felt like an excuse to have Peter invent the mutant genocide chip as a side hustle, and for a fight scene that felt way too short to be satisfying. To me, it doesn't feel like these movies justify deviating so much from the comics and throwing in all this setup and world building instead of just creating more interesting stories with personal stakes to the heroes. Peter deals with the spider mutation stuff for like 15 minutes of screen time, and then it basically gets pushed to the side until a brief moment at the end of the movie. Peter's personal drama is okay, but I feel like it grinded the pacing to a halt and couldn't have been explored or implemented better because of all the other things that the movie had to juggle. A lot of pacing and plot issues probably could have been ironed out if this was a movie instead of a TV show, and they were able to dedicate episodes to specific topics and stories, instead of having to jump around and cram all of it inside of the runtime. It wouldn't surprise me if they were originally planning for it to be a TV show, but had to make it a movie for some licensing reasons with Sony or whatever. In comparison to those two, a movie that I think skirts the line with the stuff that those two struggle with is Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. Namor obviously isn't someone who originates from Black Panther comics, but I think he serves as a very effective foil to both Wakanda and Shuri, as well as being easy to implement his motivations and personality into being a protagonist. Mostly just because he's an asshole and you don't really need to do much to make him a bad guy. He doesn't feel as invasive and distracting in inclusion as other elements introduced into Brand New Day and Brave New World. It allows space for the characters and plot lines contained to this movie to breathe and be fleshed out. Riri Williams / Ironheart's inclusion was definitely them introducing her to the MCU so she could be used in different projects, but her role in the film is significant enough to justify including her, but not so overwhelming that her presence is distracting. I think it does a good job at feeling a part of an interconnected universe where you can include a multitude of characters and plots that are able to come together due to the lore that's been built up over this entire time, compared to the other two movies that I don't really think integrate their MCU interconnected plotline story elements all that well. A bit of looser collection of thoughts to end this video. Something to consider that has definitely had an effect with this entire theory I have is the rise in streaming content and less people going to see movies. It's well known that streaming movies and shows has an effect on the memorability of the stuff we consume, and I think that can definitely lead to movies in theater having a much more profound effect on somebody, even if it's potentially lesser in quality. I saw someone compare it to the Google effect, where people store less information about specific topics in their mind and rather store the information of where it comes from, because we have so much access to an infinite web of knowledge at our fingertips at all times. We've basically dedicated less memory to storing what we consume, and I think that definitely has an effect on how we've consumed media as well. Also, on top of that, I think AI slop has really shown how low a lot of people will stoop to be entertained by something. It doesn't apply to everyone, but I think it's a significant enough amount of people to be noteworthy. I've also seen a lot of people compare MCU movies to roller coasters, which aren't really something that you're supposed to think critically of. It's mostly something to enjoy and be thrilled by, make good memories of, but not think back on it in a critiquing manner. That's pretty much how I see a lot of Marvel movies at this point, and Brand New Day was no exception. I've yapped a lot about my issues with the movie and how I feel about the MCU, but at the end of the day, I'm not trying to get anyone to be negative about the movie. If you enjoyed Brand New Day, I think that's a good thing, and I'm glad that you enjoyed the experience. I just personally can't be on board with it. I'm happy for anyone who's able to enjoy the movie, and I hope even if you disagreed with me on the movie that I still made some good points.